The studio lights of HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher gleamed across the sleek set, throwing sharp highlights over polished glass and brushed steel. Their glare seemed to amplify the quiet tension between host and guest. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat composed and steady, her navy suit immaculate, posture unshaken. Opposite her, Bill Maher leaned forward, his familiar half-smirk already suggesting the shape of the confrontation to come. "Congresswoman," he began, his tone carrying that signature blend of humor and condescension that his audience had come to expect. "You've been championing this new voting rights legislation. But let's be honest here. Aren't you just inventing fixes for problems that don't actually exist? Voter suppression," he said, pausing for effect, "is largely a myth, something Democrats use to get their base fired up." Laughter rippled through parts of the crowd, nervous, half-anticipatory. The camera swept across faces, some amused, others waiting for Crockett's reply. She gave a small nod, not in agreement but in acknowledgement. She had known this attack line was coming. "Bill," she said evenly, her voice calm but with a precise edge that commanded the air. "I practiced law long before I ever ran for office. I represented real Americans who stood in line for 7 hours just to cast a ballot. While you were here in the studio, I was in courtrooms defending elderly voters who had been illegally purged from registration rolls." Without raising her tone, she lifted a folder from her lap and held it open. "These aren't talking points. They're court cases, real plaintiffs, real decisions. Would you like to see the evidence that convinced federal judges across 3 separate circuits?" The audience fell completely silent. Then, unexpectedly, a wave of applause began. Hesitant at first, then swelling into something undeniable. Maher's smirk faltered. His practiced confidence gave way to a flicker of visible discomfort as he glanced toward the audience, realizing they were no longer with him, but with her. What had started as a calculated attempt to corner a freshman congresswoman had just transformed into something else entirely, a lesson in preparation, poise, and authenticity. Crockett hadn't merely survived Maher's challenge, she had flipped the power dynamic in real time, on his own stage. Before diving further into this extraordinary exchange, don't forget to drop a comment with where you're watching from, and subscribe for our latest political analysis on the stories reshaping American discourse. Representative Jasmine Crockett had never been the kind of politician who chased cable news attention. Her path to Congress had been built not on charisma or theatrics, but on the hard discipline of the law. Before winning her seat in 2022, she had earned a formidable reputation as a civil rights attorney in Texas, handling more than 100 voting rights cases herself. Her preparation was legendary: color-coded case files, annotated precedents, and an unwavering courtroom presence that demanded respect even from skeptical judges. Crockett's work had directly confronted restrictive voter ID laws and registration purges that disproportionately affected minority communities and elderly citizens. She didn't just study voter suppression, she fought it, one injunction and one appeal at a time. Born and raised in St. Louis, Crockett grew up in a family that saw civic duty not as a privilege, but as a moral calling. Her father, a high school history teacher who had marched for civil rights in the 1960s, often reminded her that the right to vote was the heartbeat of a democracy. Those words had shaped her entire legal philosophy after graduating from Rhodes College and earning her law degree from the University of Houston Law Center. Crockett began her career defending that heartbeat, in courtrooms, in community halls, and eventually in the Texas legislature, where she served a single term before taking her fight to Congress. As a freshman representative, she quickly developed a reputation not for sound bites but for substance. Her colleagues noted her meticulous preparation before every committee hearing and her reluctance to appear on talk shows without exhaustive briefing. "She treats hearings like court arguments," one senior member remarked. "Always overprepared, always grounded in evidence, not emotion." Bill Maher, by contrast, had built his reputation on the opposite philosophy. As the host of Real Time since 2003, he had spent decades cultivating an image as the irreverent skeptic, a provocateur who thrived on contradiction. His interviews were a blend of comedy, intellect, and confrontation. Even with guests who shared his broad political leanings, Maher prided himself on pushing buttons, questioning orthodoxy, and making audiences squirm just enough to keep them watching. At 68, he had mastered the art of the contrarian performance. Politicians came to his stage knowing they would be challenged, sometimes mocked, often interrupted, but also knowing the reach of his platform was too vast to ignore. His secret was simple. He controlled the rhythm. Most guests struggled to match his quick wit and calculated provocations. But Jasmine Crockett was not most guests. The setup for their eventual collision began when Crockett's office received an invitation from Real-Time shortly after she introduced the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2025, legislation designed to restore the core protections of the original Voting Rights Act dismantled in Shelby County. V. Holder. The bill was attracting serious attention in Washington, not just for its content, but for Crockett's ability to explain its stakes in concrete, human terms rather than abstract legalese. Her communications team was cautious. Maher likes to make progressives look foolish, her communications director warned. Crockett's answer was simple. We don't change minds by talking only to people who already agree with us, and we're not going in unprepared. The week before the taping, her preparation began in earnest. Crockett reviewed dozens of Maher's past segments on voting rights, taking careful notes on his recurring arguments, particularly his tendency to dismiss suppression claims as exaggerated. She assembled a binder thick with case law, photos, judicial findings, and personal letters from affected voters. Each page was tabbed in color-coded order: blue for statistical data, yellow for case summaries, red for first-hand testimonies. He's going to make this about philosophy, she told her team. We'll make it about people. When one aide reminded her that Maher often interrupted his guests mid-sentence, she smiled. In court, she said, we call that controlling the witness. The solution's the same. Pause, redirect, and let the evidence do the talking. As the night of the broadcast arrived, HBO's studio buzzed with pre-show energy. Technicians adjusted light levels while the audience filtered in. The set's blue and red backdrop, crafted to symbolize balanced debate, contrasted sharply with the quiet focus backstage, where two very different preparations were underway. In his dressing room, Maher scanned his cue cards, laughing softly as he rehearsed his lines. The voter ID thing always gets them, he told a producer. No one ever explains why you need ID for everything, except voting. Meanwhile, in the guest prep room, Crockett organized her materials one last time. Every document was in order, every citation memorized. Her legislative director observed quietly, impressed by her composure. Remember, he reminded her, he'll try to talk over you once the audience gets on your side. Crockett gave a confident half-smile. That's fine, she said. I've handled worse cross-examinations. When the broadcast began, Maher breezed through his monologue and a panel discussion before turning toward the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, please welcome Representative Jasmine Crockett. The audience clapped politely as she entered, exchanging a firm handshake with Maher before sitting across from him under the harsh studio lights. Congresswoman Crockett, Maher began, his smile sharp but practiced. You've become something of a rising star among progressives, especially with this new voting rights proposal. That's quite an accomplishment for someone relatively new to Congress. Thank you for having me, Bill, she replied, her tone gracious but grounded. The legislation isn't about party politics. It's about ensuring that every eligible citizen can exercise their constitutional right to vote. Maher nodded, then leaned forward, ready to pounce. Here's what I don't get, he said. We keep hearing about voter suppression, but turnout has hit record highs. In 2020, we had the highest participation in over a century. Doesn't that kind of kill the narrative that voting's getting harder? It was a classic Maher move, seemingly logical, yet designed to undermine the premise of her entire argument. Many guests might have stumbled. Crockett didn't. That's a fair question, she said, meeting his gaze directly. But high turnout and voter suppression can exist at the same time, continued in next part, as her counter-argument unfolds on live television. In fact, they often do. When communities face obstacles to voting, many people work harder to overcome them, which can mask the underlying problem. It's like saying traffic barriers don't exist because people still manage to get to work by leaving hours earlier and finding alternative routes. She reached for her binder. I have the data here, showing that in districts with new voting restrictions, the average voter spent 82 minutes longer in line than in comparable districts without those restrictions. People voted despite the barriers, not because they were absent. Ma, slightly thrown by her prepared response, pivoted to his next point. But let's talk about specific policies that get labeled as suppression, like requiring ID to vote. Most Americans, including a majority of Democrats, according to some polls, support voter ID requirements. Are you suggesting all these people favor suppression? The issue isn't identification itself, Crockett countered. It's which forms of ID are accepted and how difficult they are to obtain. She opened her binder to a marked page. In one Texas county I represented, a gun license was acceptable ID for voting. but a student ID from a state university was not. When we deposed the officials who created this policy, they couldn't provide any security-based rationale for that distinction. Maher attempted to interrupt, but Crockett continued with methodical focus. Furthermore, in counties where DMV offices were closed or had limited hours, obtaining an acceptable ID required taking unpaid time off work and traveling significant distances for hourly workers or those without personal transportation that created a substantial barrier. The audience, which had initially seemed aligned with Maher's skepticism, began showing signs of engagement with Crockett's evidence-based approach. Their attention visibly shifted toward her documentation, creating a dynamic Maher rarely encountered on his own show. Recognizing this shift, he employed a tactic that often succeeded with less prepared guests' humor, as dismissal. "Come on, Congresswoman," he said with an exaggerated eye roll. "Are we really saying people can figure out how to get a smartphone, set up social media accounts, and navigate complex benefit systems, but somehow getting an ID is this insurmountable obstacle? At some point, doesn't personal responsibility enter the equation?" The studio audience offered scattered laughter and some applause, momentarily restoring Maher's home field advantage. Many politicians would have become flustered or defensive at this point, falling into the trap of appearing overly sensitive. Crockett, however, nodded thoughtfully before responding. "Personal responsibility matters in every context, Bill. But let me introduce you to someone." She removed a photograph from her binder, holding it toward both Maher and the camera. It showed an elderly African-American woman with a dignified expression. "This is Mrs. Eleanor Hawkins, 82 years old, born in rural Mississippi, where birth certificates weren't consistently issued to African Americans in the 1,140 seconds. She voted in every election for 6 decades until new ID requirements in her state rejected her expired driver's license. She no longer drives, lives on a fixed income, and would need to spend $40 on transportation to reach the nearest government office that could help her. An office open only during weekday business hours." Crockett looked directly at Maher. She tried 3 times to get the necessary documentation. Each time she was told something different about what she needed to provide. Is that about personal responsibility? Or is it about systems designed to make voting disproportionately difficult for specific communities? The studio had fallen completely silent. The production team, accustomed to managing audience reactions, exchanged glances as they recognized something unusual was happening. Maher's audience was being persuaded against his position in real time. Maher, sensing the shift, attempted to reclaim control. "One compelling anecdote doesn't prove systematic suppression. He argued for every story like Mrs. Hawkins. There are thousands of people who manage to get IDs without issue. You're absolutely right that individual cases don't prove systems." Crockett agreed, surprising Maher with her concession before continuing. "That's why we need to look at the data." She presented another document from her binder. This analysis from the Brennan Center examined 250 counties before and after strict ID laws were implemented. The study controlled for demographics, economic factors, and political competitiveness. The finding was clear. After these laws passed, turnout decreased by an average of 3.7 percentage points among minority voters compared to statistically similar counties without such restrictions. She turned a page in her binder. And when we look at which communities face polling place closures, reduced early voting, and purged voter rolls, the pattern becomes even clearer. In the 5 states I've represented cases in, these measures disproportionately affected minority communities by a factor of 3 to 1. Maher, visibly frustrated by Crockett's command of both anecdotal and statistical evidence, tempted a more direct challenge. "Congresswoman, with respect, don't Democrats benefit politically from making these claims about suppression? It rallies your base, brings in donations, and provides an excuse for any potential losses. Isn't there a vested interest in exaggerating these concerns?" The question was designed to force Crockett into a defensive posture about partisan motivations. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. "Political incentives always exist on all sides of any issue," she acknowledged. "That's precisely why I'm not asking anyone to simply take my word for it." She removed several more documents from her binder. These are court decisions, many written by Republican-appointed judges, that found specific voting restrictions violated constitutional rights. They didn't rule based on partisan talking points, but on evidence presented under oath and subject to cross-examination. She handed copies to Ma. "In the past 5 years alone, federal courts have struck down voting restrictions in Texas, North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona after finding that the burden on voters couldn't be justified by any legitimate state interest. These aren't partisan claims. They're legal findings established through the adversarial process our judicial system relies on." Maher glanced at the documents momentarily, at a loss for his usual quick retort. The audience, sensing his hesitation, began applauding Crockett's thorough presentation, a rare moment when a real-time guest had visibly gained the upper hand through preparation rather than performance. Recognizing the need to regain control of his show, Maher tried one final approach. "Let me ask you directly," he said, his tone becoming more serious. "If your bill passed tomorrow and every provision you're advocating was implemented, would you then acknowledge that any future election losses were fair, or would there always be some new form of suppression to claim?" It was a classic false dichotomy designed to paint Crockett into a corner, but she recognized the tactic immediately. Elections should be evaluated on their specific circumstances, not through blanket declarations, she replied. "What I can tell you is that when every eligible voter can register easily, when waiting times are reasonably similar across communities, when working people have sufficient opportunities to cast their ballots, and when valid votes are correctly counted, then we'll have elections that truly reflect the will of the people regardless of which candidates or parties win." She closed her binder, making direct eye contact with Maher. "This isn't about ensuring specific outcomes, Bill. It's about upholding the fundamental principle that in a democracy, the right to vote should not depend on your zip code, work schedule, physical ability, or economic resources. That's not a progressive position or a conservative position. It's an American position rooted in constitutional values." The studio audience burst into spontaneous applause, not the polite acknowledgement typically offered to guests, but the enthusiastic response usually reserved for Maher's own most pointed commentaries. The host, recognizing he had lost this particular exchange, nodded with reluctant respect before glancing at his producers for the signal to break for commercial. "We'll be right back with more from Congresswoman Crockett after this," he said, his tone suggesting he recognized that the second half of the interview would require a different approach than he had initially planned. As the cameras cut away, the production team exchanged glances, recognizing they had just witnessed something rare. A guest who had shifted the audience's allegiance through substance rather than style and who had done so on the host's own carefully controlled platform. When the commercial break ended, attentive viewers noticed a subtle but significant shift in the dynamic between host and guest. Bill Maher, a television veteran skilled at controlling his program's trajectory, had visibly recalibrated his approach. His posture was slightly less forward-leaning, his expression more thoughtful than combative as the cameras returned to the set. "Welcome back to my conversation with Representative Jasmine Crockett." He began his tone noticeably more measured. "Congresswoman, before the break, you made some compelling points about specific barriers to voting. I want to shift gears slightly and ask about solutions. Your legislation proposes several remedies, but critics suggest they might open the door to potential fraud. How do you respond to concerns about election security?" The question remained challenging but lacked the dismissive edge of his earlier approach, a tacit acknowledgement that Crockett had earned a more substantive exchange. "Election security and voter access aren't opposing goals. They're complementary," Crockett responded, maintaining her evidence-based approach. "Every provision in our bill maintains or enhances security protocols while removing unnecessary barriers." She opened her binder to another tabbed section. "For instance, we propose automatic voter registration through secure government databases like the Social Security Administration, which actually improves accuracy by reducing manual data entry errors. We support paper ballot backups for all electronic systems, risk-limiting audits, and cybersecurity resources for local election offices." Maher nodded, engaging more genuinely with her response than he had earlier, but specifically on the question of voter ID, which we discussed earlier. "Do you oppose identification requirements? Where's the balance between access and verification?" "Our bill doesn't eliminate identification. It expands the acceptable forms and ensures they're accessible to all eligible voters," Crockett explained. "We propose a national standard that includes non-photo options like utility bills and bank statements for voters who sign affidavit, similar to the system used successfully in many states with minimal fraud issues." She presented another document. This report analyzed the 31 credible cases of in-person voter impersonation found nationwide between 2000 and 2024, out of more than 1 billion votes cast. By contrast, restrictive ID laws prevented an estimated 240,000 eligible voters from casting ballots in 2022 alone. The solution should be proportional to the actual problem. This measured fact-based approach continued to resonate with the studio audience, whose attention remained focused on the substance of the exchange rather than the performative aspects that typically dominated Maher's interviews. When Crockett cited specific provisions of her legislation, several audience members nodded in apparent agreement, a visual cue that didn't escape the host's notice. Recognizing that his typical approach wasn't proving effective, Maher pivoted to a more collaborative tone. Let me play devil's advocate on one more point, he said, not because I necessarily disagree with you, but because it's a concern many Americans have. Doesn't standardizing election procedures nationally undermine the traditional state control of elections that's been part of our system since the founding? The framing was notably more respectful, presenting the question as a legitimate concern rather than a partisan talking point. And Crockett responded in kind. That's a thoughtful question that gets to our constitutional structure. She acknowledged the Constitution gives states primary authority over elections, but it also specifically empowers Congress to override state regulations for federal elections. The framers built in this federal oversight precisely because they recognized that states might create unfair election systems. She turned to another tab page. James Madison specifically addressed this in Federalist 59, warning that without congressional oversight power, states might create unequal and oppressive voting requirements that would undermine true representation. Our bill respects state administration while establishing baseline standards that ensure equal access for all eligible voters. Exactly the balance the Constitution envisions. This historical context visibly impressed several balancing audience members, including some who had initially seemed aligned with Maher's skepticism. The host himself raised his eyebrows slightly, clearly not having anticipated such a specific constitutional reference. You've clearly done your homework, he conceded with a hint of the respect he typically reserved for intellectual equals rather than political talking heads. One last question before we wrap up. Given the polarization around election issues, do you see any realistic path to bipartisan support for voting rights legislation? The question offered Crockett an opportunity to pivot toward partisan talking points, or to attack Republican positions, as many politicians might have done. Instead, she maintained her evidence-focused approach. There's more common ground than cable news might suggest, she replied. When we look at specific provisions rather than partisan packages, we find substantial agreement. For example, 76% of Republican voters support early voting options, 68% support automatic registration when obtaining a driver's license, and 82% support paper ballot backups for all electronic systems. All provisions in our bill. She closed her binder deliberately. The path forward isn't demonizing those who disagree, but emphasizing the shared values that underlie our democratic system. That every eligible citizen should be able to cast a vote that counts. That our elections should be both secure and accessible. And that the resulting government should truly reflect the will of the people. Those aren't partisan principles, they're American principles. The studio audience responded with the most enthusiastic applause of the segment, a response typically reserved for Maher's own closing arguments rather than those of his guests. The host, recognizing the unusual dynamic that had developed, nodded with what appeared to be genuine respect. Representative Crockett, we're out of time, but I want to thank you for a substantive conversation, Maher said, his tone suggesting he had gained a new appreciation for his guests during their exchange. Whatever one's position on the specific legislation, you've clearly thought deeply about these issues. As the segment concluded and the program moved to its closing monologue, the production team noted something remarkable in their monitoring of social media response. While Maher's interviews typically generated partisan reactions with viewers either applauding or condemning both host and guest along predictable political lines, the responses to Crockett's appearance cut across typical divisions. Conservative viewers commented that while they might not agree with all her positions, they appreciated her factual approach and respectful tone. Progressive viewers expressed surprise at the substantive nature of the exchange, having anticipated more conflict and less content. The common theme across responses was appreciation for apolitical discussion that prioritized evidence over emotion and substance over sound bites. In the post-show production meeting, Maher himself acknowledged the unusual nature of the segment. She came better prepared than almost any politician we've had. He told his executive producer didn't take the bait on anything, might not agree with all her positions, but she knew her stuff. This assessment, coming from a host known for his skepticism toward politicians of all parties, represented perhaps the clearest indication that Crockett's approach had succeeded not merely in advancing her policy positions, but in changing the nature of the conversation itself. As video clips of the exchange began circulating online within hours of the broadcast, political analysts noted that Crockett had accomplished something rare in contemporary media appearances. She had used a challenging interview on unfriendly terrain, not as a platform for performative confrontation, but as an opportunity to present substantive arguments that might actually persuade viewers who didn't already agree with her. In doing so, she had demonstrated that preparation, evidence, and measured delivery could sometimes overcome even the most carefully constructed media environments, and that audiences, when presented with substance rather than spectacle, might still respond to the better argument rather than the louder voice. The repercussions of Crockett's appearance on Real Time extended far beyond the immediate broadcast, influencing both her individual political trajectory and broader conversations about effective political communication in a fractured media landscape. Within hours of the show's airing, clips of the exchange had gone viral across multiple platforms. The most widely shared moment, Crockett presenting Mrs. Hawkins' photograph, while methodically explaining the practical barriers to obtaining identification, garnered over 4 million views by the following morning. The comment sections revealed something unusual in contemporary political discourse. Viewers from across the ideological spectrum, acknowledging the effectiveness of her presentation, even when they didn't fully embrace her conclusions. "I still support voter ID laws," wrote one commenter with a conservative-leaning profile, "but I never considered the specific challenges she described. Makes me think we need better solutions for legitimate cases like the woman she mentioned." This cross-ideological impact became the subject of analysis from media observers and political strategists alike. The Columbia Journalism Review published a feature titled "The Crockett Method: How Evidence-Based Advocacy Changed the Conversation on HBO," examining how her approach had temporarily transformed the typically combative format of political talk shows. What distinguished Representative Crockett's appearance wasn't just her command of facts, but her deliberate refusal to engage in the performative outrage that typically dominates these exchanges, the analysis noted. By maintaining a courtroom-like focus on evidence rather than emotion, she effectively changed the criteria by which viewers evaluated her arguments. For Crockett herself, the aftermath brought both opportunities and strategic considerations. Her office reported a surge in media requests from outlets across the political spectrum, including several that rarely featured progressive politicians. Morning shows, Sunday political programs, and podcast hosts all sought to book the representative who had turned Bill Maher's audience against him with facts rather than fire. Rather than immediately capitalizing on this attention, Crockett and her team made a calculated decision that reflected her substantive approach to public service. She declined most interview requests, selecting only those forums that would allow for detailed policy discussions rather than quick hit appearances designed to generate viral clips. The congressman's priority is advancing legislation, not becoming ackable news regular. Her communications director explained to disappointed bookers, she'll participate in conversations that allow for substantive exploration of policy details, not those structured around creating conflict for ratings. This selective approach initially puzzled some political consultants who saw her real-time momentum as an opportunity to build a national profile quickly. However, it soon revealed its strategic wisdom as Crockett began appearing in forums that amplified her substantive message rather than diluting it through overexposure. Her appearance on Fresh Air with Terry Gross allowed for a 40-minute discussion of voting rights, history and current challenges, reaching an audience of thoughtful listeners across political perspectives. A long-form print interview in The Atlantic provided space for detailed explanation of specific provisions in her legislation, complete with historical context and contemporary data. These carefully chosen platforms reinforced her reputation as a serious legislator focused on governance rather than self-promotion. Within Congress, the impact of her media approach translated into unexpected legislative opportunities. 3 weeks after the real-time appearance, a moderate Republican representative from Michigan approached Crockett on the House floor. "I watched your Maher interview," had told her, according to staffers who observed the exchange. "Some of my constituents sent it to me. Actually, I don't agree with everything in your bill, but I think there might be provisions we could work on together, particularly the election security funding and standard early voting periods." This conversation eventually led to a narrower bipartisan bill focused on election infrastructure funding, cybersecurity resources for local election officials, and standardized early voting periods. While more limited than Crockett's original proposal, this legislation attracted support from representatives in both parties, who recognized the political benefits of being associated with common-sense improvements to election administration. When this focused bill passed the House 4 months later, with support from 32 Republican representatives, political analysts identified Crockett's evidence-based advocacy as a crucial factor in its success. By framing voting access as a matter of evidence rather than ideology, Representative Crockett created space for cooperation that wouldn't have existed in the typical partisan framework, noted Congressional Quarterly in its analysis of the vote. Her approach allowed lawmakers to evaluate specific provisions on their merits rather than through purely partisan lenses. Beyond her individual legislative achievements, Crockett's real-time appearance spawned what political communication experts began calling evidence-based persuasion, an approach that several candidates and elected officials deliberately adopted in subsequent months. A Democratic gubernatorial candidate in North Carolina explicitly cited Crockett's example when explaining his debate preparation. "We're following the Crockett model, less time practicing zingers, more time organizing evidence that voters can actually evaluate." His subsequent victory in a traditionally Republican-leaning state suggested the approach had merit beyond the confines of media appearances. Even Bill Maher himself acknowledged the impact of their exchange. In an interview with the New York Times 3 months later, when asked about memorable guests, he mentioned Crockett specifically. "She came in with a level of preparation you rarely see in politicians these days. Didn't try to own me or play to her base, just methodically presented evidence for her position. I still disagree with some of her conclusions, but I respect how she arrived at them. We could use more of that approach on both sides." For media training consultants who typically advise politicians on message discipline and emotional appeals, Crockett's success prompted a reevaluation of conventional wisdom. Several prominent firms began offering new training modules with names like evidence-based advocacy and persuasion through preparation, explicitly referencing the Crockett-Maher exchange as a case study in effective communication. We're seeing a growing recognition that in a fragmented media environment saturated with emotional appeals, factual precision and methodical presentation can actually help candidates break through, explained Dr. Rebecca Chen, a political communication professor at Stanford University. Representative Crockett demonstrated that audiences across the political spectrum still respond to substantive arguments when they're presented in an accessible, evidence-based manner. Perhaps most significantly, Crockett's approach influenced how some media outlets structured their political segments. Producers at several news programs began requiring guests to submit specific evidence for their claims in advance, shifting away from the rapid-fire, assertion-based exchanges that had dominated political television for decades. The Crockett effect, as one producer termed it, referred to the audience's positive response to factual, evidence-based exchanges rather than performative confrontation. While this shift remained limited to certain programs and formats, it represented a meaningful reconsideration of assumptions about what audiences found engaging in political discourse. For Crockett herself, the long-term impact extended beyond media appearances and legislative strategy to her fundamental approach to public service. In a rare reflective interview 1 year after her real-time appearance, she connected her methodology to deeper democratic principles. "Our system depends on the assumption that citizens can evaluate evidence and reach reasoned judgments," she explained. "When we reduce politics to tribal performance or emotional manipulation, we're essentially abandoning that core democratic principle. My experience both in courtrooms and in Congress suggests that people respond positively when you respect their capacity to evaluate evidence rather than just appealing to their partisan identities." This philosophy informed not only her media strategy, but her constituent services, legislative drafting and committee work. A comprehensive approach that maintains substance and evidence as central rather than peripheral elements of political engagement. As political communication continued evolving in subsequent years, the Crockett-Maher exchange remained a reference point for discussions about effective advocacy in polarized environments. It demonstrated that even in an era often characterized by partisan performance and emotional appeals, substantive arguments presented with precision and respect could still occasionally transcend tribal alignments and engage audiences on their merits. For citizens increasingly frustrated by the performative aspects of political discourse, this example offered a hopeful counterpoint, a reminder that preparation could sometimes prevail over provocation, and that evidence, when methodically presented, could occasionally persuade even initially skeptical audiences. As one constituent wrote to Crockett's office following her appearance, "I didn't vote for you and probably won't agree with all your positions, but watching you discuss complex issues with evidence rather than just emotional appeals made me proud to have you representing our district. That approach deserves respect regardless of party in a political landscape often defined by division." Such responses suggested that substantive engagement might still offer a path toward the functional discourse that democratic governance requires, a possibility worth pursuing, even when easier, more performative alternatives might seem temporarily advantageous. If you found this analysis valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth political coverage. Comment below what political figures do you think effectively use evidence-based approaches in their public appearances. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important stories to